Schlossbach. I am the chairman of the Human Relations Commission, and also in collaboration with Vin Ferraro to my left, who works with the sociology department at Framingham State University. We had talked a number of months ago about having a forum dealing with this particular issue. And at that time, I appreciated my daughter, who works for Spectrum and deals with a program in Worcester, Everyday Miracles, and where she came and talked to us about life in Worcester and some of the difficulties that they have and contend with out there. But the issue of trafficking came up also in discussion, and she spoke about some of the people that she assists while out there, some who had been trafficked and are in the process of, if you call it, I guess, recovery. And that led us even more so to want to do something locally, and thanks to the Police Chief Ferguson, who helped us in coordinating an individual who works with the town in this area, we then just snowballed to what was going to be tonight, I think, and will be a very successful program dealing with human trafficking. So I thank those who were able to make it here. And again, I thank the guests who have traveled to get here. And we would like to begin the program right away. I'd like to introduce Vin Ferraro from Framingham State University.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to start by echoing Bob's thanks to our esteemed committee for being here tonight and to those who could be here in attendance as well. The topic of human trafficking is one that has been a major focus, as Bob mentioned, for the Framingham Human Relations Commission and for Framingham State University and its students as well. It's a topic that has seemed to roil just below the surface of public discourse, not just locally, but nationally and internationally as well. And our hope here this evening is to shed some light on the often hidden nature of human trafficking for those who may be coming to it for the first time. And for those who may have some background on the topic already, we hope tonight's talk offers some insight into the myriad forms it may take, the effects on its victims, and the steps being taken on the ground and in our courts to combat human trafficking. And so we have an esteemed panel of experts from many different perspectives here with us tonight, and they're here to address the demand and the interest in the public to know more and to share with us their efforts and their experiences. We have Sergeant Richard Pomales of the Framingham Police Department, Sherry Jimenez, Director of the Survivor-led AVA Center in Boston, Jennifer Snook, Assistant Attorney General in the Human Trafficking Unit of the Massachusetts Office of the Attorney General, Middlesex Assistant District Attorney and Deputy Chief of the Child Protection Unit, Patrick Fitzgerald, Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan, and Elizabeth Bouchard, Case Coordinator of the Scene Coalition at the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County. For tonight's format, each of our speakers will present for about 15 minutes, and following the last presentation, we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for the panelists to address Q&A with the audience. And as we have quite a bit to cover tonight, I'd like to jump right in with our first speaker and to bring him up, Sergeant Richard Pomales. Sergeant Pomales has 28 years' experience on the force. His past assignments include serving on patrol with the Detective Bureau, as a field training officer, as a substation community policing officer, and as patrol supervisor. He currently serves as supervisor of the Framingham Police Department's Street Crimes Unit. Sergeant Pomales is a graduate of Massachusetts State Police Academy, 79th Municipal Patrol Officers Class. He's a 2007 graduate of the Homeland Security's 287G program. He received his bachelor's degree in law enforcement and criminal justice from Western New England College. Please join me in welcoming Sergeant Richard Pomales.
Thank you all for coming. Chief Ferguson will be coming down, hopefully, if the traffic subsides. He's monitoring the traffic from the station. But first of all, the reason why I called my presentation Framingham Human Traffic Update is the human trafficking laws were, at least in Massachusetts, came into effect 3 years ago, at least our current statutes. There wasn't any human trafficking statute prior to this. There was some on the federal level. When I first came on in Framingham, we weren't as aware of a lot of the issues that were going on. I recall back in the early 90s when I was called to help to translate one of the officers, and we ended up doing about 8 restraining orders out of a house. And if it was today, we would probably be building a human trafficking case on that. At that time, the parties in the house were holding all the victims' passports. They were all females. They were also not paying them, and all the victims wanted at the time. They just wanted to get their passports and get away from the household, and get the restraining orders, and that's what we did at the time. But as I said, if that was today, we'd probably be notifying District Attorney Martha Ryan's office and building a pretty good trafficking case off of that. As for today, current level, we have human trafficking issues going on as it is nationwide and worldwide in our hotels and motels, with the prostitution issues or escorts, which is all part of the human trafficking. We're getting the same problems that's going on, as I said, nationwide. These girls are being trafficked from different locations. One day they'll be in Framingham for a couple of days. Next day they'll be in Woburn. They'll be in New York tomorrow. We've been trying to monitor this for the last 2 to 3 years in conjunction with the DA's office. Also, we've had a proliferation in our town, just like we do everywhere else, of massage parlors opening up, or body works as they're called. And we've been working with, once again, ICE, the DA's office, and other agencies trying to monitor it and do what we can. Unfortunately, just like with the back page and with the massage parlors, you have to have the victims say that they're victims and need help, and that's what we're encountering locally and nationally. I believe I read somewhere that there's about 27 million victims worldwide, probably more. With our population, undocumented population over here, we have the trafficking part in that a lot of people are being brought up through the basically not smuggled, but they're being brought up either through the networks from Brazil, from Mexico, and we've actually had about 5 years ago, we had one of the traffickers actually pull up in front of the station asking us for directions, and one of the officers got a hold of Detective Henry and me, and we ended up making a pretty good case with immigration on that. There was 2 Mexican traffickers, and they were they were part of the transport network that were bringing up people from Houston to Atlanta. We've had people come to our front desk telling us about their relatives being held in at times they think it's the United States, but it's in Mexico, and we've actually been able to coordinate with ICE and at times with the FBI, but mostly with ICE, and to make some successful rescues both in Houston and in Mexico. A couple of the families have actually come by afterwards to thank us on that, and as I said, it's something that we try to build the trust with the community, let them know that whatever issues they have, they come to us and talk to us. We want to help them in a lot of different countries. People don't trust the police because in Mexico, Brazil, unfortunately, there's a lot of corruption in the police departments, and at times, even when you come to the police department to talk to the police may be in conjunction with the working with the traffickers. I had a guy one day that when we arrested him, he was pretty excited because he thought that we were bringing him back to the station for him to get some services from a female, and he was telling me that's happens in Brazil a lot. That the actual brothel or locations are right in the police stations, which I don't know if it's like that current date, but this was going back a couple of years. But that's the kind of stuff that we have to work with over here. The unit in the Framingham Police Department that does a lot of these cases is the street crimes unit, which I'm the supervisor of. Currently, Officer Patriarca and Officer Sheehan are normally working these cases with me. We get calls almost on a daily basis from ICE or from citizens out in the street about activity. Unfortunately, we do other we have other assignments also, but we pass this information on to ICE, or at the same time other agencies call us, such as Natick and Milford, which we've assisted them on a couple of their massage parlor cases. Human trafficking is compelling someone to work or to engage in a commercial sex act. That's one phase of human trafficking. There's also labor, where people aren't getting paid. We recently had a case over here that it's encompassing a little bit of both sex and labor. Most prostitutes are coerced or recruited by the pimps. The age of entry into prostitution is, on the average, about 13 to 14 years old. What we're finding out nationally is that a lot of the young girls are either runaways or have problems at home, and a lot of the pimps are predators, and they're making these girls think that there's a better life out there, that they're their family, they're here to help them, and next thing you know, they either have them. They used to be traditionally working the streets, but now, as I said, once again, they're taking them around to the hotels and motels, getting on the internet, Backpage, Craigslist, internet sites like that. Once again, the pimps target the girls that are vulnerable, lonely, homeless, rebellious. Once these girls are recruited or purchased, they're kept in bondage to the pimp by verbal and physical abuse. Some of the training that we've been to recently, we're finding out that a lot of these girls are getting tattooed or mocked, and there's a network out there amongst the pimps and the traffickers that even if a girl tries to escape and goes either to another jurisdiction, whatever, if another pimp or trafficker comes across her, he can identify her almost like a barcode. They've reached out cross-country, cross-state, wherever, to the pimp or trafficker, tell them I have your girl over here, and what do you want me to do? Do you want me to take her back? Do you want me to have her work over here? Can I buy her off you? The reasons why these girls stay with their pimps is they want to. It's because of a human bond. They're looking for emotional support. They isolate the girls, just like in the massage parlors. And the massage parlors are, a lot of these girls actually are living there on site. They make them pay rent also while they're there. Can't go anywhere. They don't have access. They don't have keys to come and go. Prostitution is not inherently harmful, and it's dehumanizing to women and children. It also fuels the growth of trafficking in persons on modern-day slavery. We haven't seen a lot of the young girls over here in town. We have encountered two recently that we're working with the DA's office. And once again, the big thing here is not just the girls, but we have to get them to tell us what's going on, and at times even the parents, because a lot of times the parents, the parents either don't have that great a relationship with the kids, so it's kind of hard because it's the reason why some of these girls ran away in the first place is because of the parents. So it's like a double-edged sword for the girls. And debunking myths. It's everyone thinks that that a lot of the girls either come from one social economic background, they come from all backgrounds. There's girls out there from some of the richest neighborhoods in the country that are in this, and men. No borders are needed, no legal age requirement. Coercion is not a movement. Traffickers don't see borders. As I said, some of the girls that we've had here that we've talked to, the women, they've told us about traveling to Mexico, coming in through the Bahamas, through Canada, and all, it's all traffic. For smuggling, trafficking, it's a movement that's undocumented. It could be voluntary or involuntary. Usually involves illegal border crossing or transportation, but at times these girls may come over legally. These guys may get them their visas or whatever through their network, get them over here legally, then they hold on to their visas, and they basically control these girls or boys. Trafficking is coercion, involuntary, and it's crimes against the person and the people. It's, once again, it involves exploitation. As I said before, it's not always about the sex side. It also includes labor cases. The myth is always that it involves minors, but it doesn't. Most forced labor victims are adults. Sex trafficking victims can be adults and minors. Once again, through force, fraud, and coercion, it's not needed for minors. And some myths are that human trafficking victims do not identify themselves as victims. There's usually shame involved. A lot of times there's a lack of understanding about their rights, but even if they do understand their rights, it's ingrained on them by their pimps or their traffickers what to say to the police or the authorities or the non-government agencies that are there to assist them. They're basically also told that if they tell the cops or anyone about what's going on, they'll harm their family. That's a common theme. There's a distrust of law enforcement, because from the past, law enforcement would come in and always arrest the woman, the prostitute, the escort, and the guy might escape free. And this is what these guys are telling these girls. They're telling them that I'm here, I'm the only one that cares about you. When the police come, they're going to arrest you. They're going to take you to jail. It'll be up to me to go and get you out. And that's what happens a lot of times. Oh, actually, most times. We recently had a case that we arrested a young lady, and gave her every opportunity to tell us, that she was a victim. That's what we try to do. We talked to the girls before we arrest them. We inform them of our services, Polaris Project, the Lutheran Social Services out in Worcester. This particular girl, we talked to her. I talked to Gretchen Golds from SMOC, who was a great assist, and I also reached out with this victim, to Sherry Jimenez. This particular young lady wouldn't tell us anything. We ended up arresting her. We arrested the gentleman who we pretty sure was a pimp. 99.9% sure was a pimp, even though she didn't say it, but everything else pointed to it. Afterwards, she was telling us that after at the police station, she was telling us completely off the record. She didn't want to. She kept on saying that he wasn't a pimp, but that this girl was only 23 years old, came from a well-to-do neighborhood out west. Nothing on her record. She was telling us that she had 23 pimps, and basically we're talking about a 3-year period. And she was telling us about the physical abuse that she went through from each different one. And that's another common theme. Most of these girls that we run into, they'll tell us that somewhere along the line they've been raped by one of their clients or even their pimps. And once again, it's all about control, and that's basically what rape is also. It's all about control. And one of the myths is that these girls want to be rescued. It would be nice if we can rescue everyone that we come across, but unfortunately, as I said, we have to appreciate the ones that actually do come forward, but still avail them to the services that are out there, and hopefully they'll reach out to someone, even if not us, as we tell them, they can reach out to someone afterwards. The enforcement efforts, once again, we monitor the back page. We've set up a system with the hotels and motels where not only do we go around checking the hotels and motels almost on a nightly basis to see if they are aware of anyone that's in there that we should, that they can make us aware of. Also, there's a program that we install with two of the motels. We're going to put in the other motels also, that any incident at the hotels or motels automatically generates a email to me, to the hotel managers, and Chief Ferguson. And this Asian Body Works, that's just another cover for a massage. In Massachusetts and most places, you need to have a license to be a certified massage therapist. And you're subject to inspection. There's one state inspector for the state of Massachusetts who we've worked with. He's come out here a couple of times, but he's the only one for the 351 cities and towns, one inspector. And they know this just like they know around the country, so they've changed the language to Asian Body Works, Reiki Massage, whatever, but it's all pretty much the same. We monitor some of the other sites also, which kind of helps us out in identifying where these places are. But your average clientele in these places are usually older male, guys around 40, 50 years old. Then extra security cameras around the premises. It's not necessarily to monitor for security; it's monitoring for the police. And also, the other thing that they monitor for is to make sure that if the girls are charging someone for 30 minutes, that that person paid them for half an hour. We work off of not just surveillance, but tips from citizens, business owners. We do our investigation. We do a lot of follow-up investigations. We're checking the business licenses of a lot of these massage parlors and body works places. We're finding similarities as other cities and towns are. Social media is a back page. Sex Guide, Craigslist. Chief Ferguson is part of the Massachusetts Human Trafficking Task Force. There's 19 members on that task force between law enforcement, the DA's office, and non-government organizations. And I believe that is all for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Pomales. I'd now like to invite up Sherry Jimenez for her talk, Exiting Out Best Practices. Sherry Jimenez used her own past experiences to develop the Ava Center Education Vision and Advocacy Center, formerly Kim's Project, to assist women in the often complex process of exiting out of the sex trade. Having survived a number of years in the sex trade herself, she knows firsthand the sexual and physical violence inherent in the industry. After exiting, she worked to complete her education, eventually acquiring a degree from UMass Boston, which enabled her to become a more skilled and impassioned activist. She has done numerous presentations on this issue, along with running the center, and is currently involved with an international group of survivors, recently campaigning in Ireland to implement the Nordic model, which criminalizes the buying and decriminalizes the selling, the best solution to ending prostitution and sex trafficking. Please join me in welcoming Sherry Jimenez.
Thank you. So I'll begin by explaining what I do. I coordinate the EVA Center, and I'm located at the Family Justice Center of Boston, and upstairs from me is the Boston Police Trafficking Unit. I work a lot with law enforcement. Beth Bouchard is upstairs as well. And so what's happened here is that there's been a shift, a good shift, in not arresting women, but, helping them access services. There's been more of a focus on the demand and the people that exploit women and girls. And so with this shift comes the police, when the police are mostly the first responders. So in situations where women are in a crisis and want to access services, they call me. And what I do is we do the center. We call it an exit program because it best explains this sort of process of getting out. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions. This is oftentimes entrenched industry. It's a very shameful thing. Women don't talk about this. And so consequently, there's been a lot of what they call survivor-led programs throughout the country. One of them, the biggest one, is out in Minneapolis. And the reason for the survivor-led programs is because it's almost like shared stories. When women have been so marginalized in life, it's very hard for people to come forward, sort of explain their situation, build a trust with people, and because you got to get the story to understand what's going on to help women get out of this. It's very individualized. Everybody's story is very different. There's common themes. Often women have the same shared stories, but also you have to understand the differences here and helping and getting the story from women, and that's always challenging. So it's helped, being in that industry myself. I look at it as an industry. It's harmful. I try not to make these distinctions between trafficking and prostitution because it's very intertwined. Sometimes people have this sort of notion of, okay, human trafficking, and then there's that other. It's a harmful industry. I can't emphasize that enough. And so consequently, what is exciting throughout the world, there is this sort of understanding how harmful it is and what we need to do to shut it down, actually. So Europe is really paving the way, implementing sort of what Sweden did in the beginning with the sex purchase law, which really criminalizes the buying, not the selling. It sort of reduces the demand. So it's just because that's what fuels this harmful industry. So just think about it in those terms first, because, as I talk about exiting, just think about, this is really the ultimate goal for a lot of us. We work to do this. I met hundreds of women. I started this program in 2006, and I've listened to the stories of women. I mean, I have to say, from, working with law enforcement, I work with federal, local, state. We have a huge domestic prostitution issue here. Sometimes we don't want to acknowledge that. Sometimes we want to look at it something, from some other place. And the reason we do is because we have a really vulnerable young population of women. Most of the referrals I get are between 18 to 25. Because just for the fact that we have a disparity in a lot of places now, and I know for some of you that might have young people, just the fact of you need an education, viable skills to make it in the world today. You have to have something that you feel like you can, support yourself, your families. And so consequently, we have a lot of young people who come age out of systems, maybe took off when they were 14, 15. So now they're maybe young adults. And without the supports in place, then that sets up this vulnerability for women to get into this. So one of my first slides that I like to at least explain to people, so you sort of get the picture here, that trafficking is not just this one single event. It's very often, more times than all the hundreds of women I've met, it's a continuum of exploitation and abuse that happens over time, a prolonged exposure to violence. Because sometimes, there's always been that stigma, and I think we get this now in working with law enforcement too. Sometimes, we sort of separate, those sort of, victims that might behave in a certain way that sort of sets up this sort of dynamic of sort of good victims and maybe the not so good victims that are difficult to work with. And the reason why sometimes people are difficult is because this sort of exposure to violence and what it does to people when you become very disempowered. Oftentimes the stories, the themes are the same. Like people have said earlier, it does affect, this is an industry that affects a lot of people, but primarily It's this vulnerability, and it's usually about economic vulnerability here. Because you have to understand how people get into this and how to fix it. So, you know, it usually starts, you know, poverty, child abuse, neglect, community violence, emotional abuse, family violence. I have listened to stories of young women, and it always amazes me of the amount of violence that they've been exposed to. And then we're talking people and young people from our communities here, too. And so, you know, you have to sort of understand this, because it really, not only economically, they come out of underfunded schools with no skills, no viable options. And so this is what leads people, you know, in this vulnerability. And top of that is this exposure to violence, not having, you know, been nurtured, sort of been supported, sort of been, you know, have these support systems in place so that you have the best chance to succeed in life. You're talking a population of people that don't have that. So, you know, we have to understand where they're coming from in order for them to exit out, because it's not an event that happens, it's a process. I'm not sure how to. Bottom one? So I'm just going to explain. I'm just going to explain to you a few things about what are the barriers in exiting out, because sometimes people have this sort of false notion, like, you know, it's sort of this one event that people just need, you know, if you just need housing or a safe home or just something simple like that, that's going to solve the problem. Because there's been a lot of research now on, you know, in trying to provide services, especially as we shift, and now we look at this, is that we focus on sort of the perpetrators and the men who fuel this industry, and look at the women as being sort of victims and vulnerable to this. And I want to say again, most of the young women, you know, whether they're foreign nationals or not, are usually up underneath some sort of coercive relationship here. You know, a lot of the young women I meet, 90%, I could say, maybe probably 95% at least, were under some sort of pimp-controlled violent relationship. You know, with technology, with posting of ads, it's made it very easy, you know, easy money. So this is like, you know, it's a complicated situation here, and Xing out is complicated. So I just wanted people to understand, you know, some of the factors that come into play in trying to help women out, okay? And this probably goes along with girls, too, but the longer you stay in this, the harder it is to get out. So, you know, there's the individual factors that come into play, people's ability to sort of even, you know, when we're trying to change our own lives, those, you know, those sort of, you know, internal factors and drives that enable some of us to make change easier than others. You know, a person's ability to sort of see themselves doing something else. Most of the young people, again, that I work with, probably dropped out of school in 9th grade, 10th grade. You know, maybe they were in the systems, or, and, you know, so this is the common thing here. When we talk about, like, you know, prevention, we really have to look at poverty issues here and disparities, not just economic disparities, but educational disparities, because the biggest thing that we try to do with the center is try to reconnect people back into school and work. And reconnecting back into school means sort of almost redoing education here, because it's about limited options and not having, none of us would have gotten into this if we had options at the time and other sort of like viable, you know, alternatives to this. So, you know, we have to look at these different things. There's the individual factors, lack of life skills. I work with a lot of young people who have come out of systems that they weren't able to sort of develop their own skills to navigate the world. And without that, it's almost like having to sort of mentor and having this sort of redo, you know, or reteach young people just how to, you know, how to navigate different things. Coping skills. You know, we work with a lot of programs. A lot of young women need access to safety, to shelter, but without coping skills to deal with conflict and to deal with sort of different things and stress level. Oftentimes I take people, young people somewhere, when I get a call from law enforcement and finding, you know, that they need a safe place, but can't deal with, you know, a conflict. A fight happens in a minute with someone else. And so sometimes we want to look at somebody, you know, and think that, you know, they're just difficult, or they're just not cooperative, or they're this or that. So when we look at the reasons for this, it's because of this exposure to violence, lack of being able to develop these good coping skills. So it's really like a very complicated situation here. So just to paint a picture that this is not an easy like journey out for women. And so usually what happens too in the very beginning, it takes a lot of us to really get to sort of like, you know, have a sort of a working relationship with young women and hearing from them, their story. They are the experts in their own lives. I'm not the expert, you know, on what they need to do. You know, we want to give power back to women that have had it taken away from them. So this is why we spend a long time talking to women, finding out what they need. You know, it also helps too because sometimes people voluntarily come forward, want to hold their perpetrators accountable. And in order to do that, they have to also, you know, envision another life and that they will have the supports to be able to do this. So there's that. There's the relational factors that really play a big role. These are all intertwined. So this isn't a, like, you know, one event process here. We're just going to, like, help somebody get into somewhere, and then their life is going to be fine. It's not like that. Trust me. I've been doing this for years. So sometimes it's about whose people's support systems are. Because it's all, in a lot of situations, it's like people have to develop a whole new support system for themselves and break away from those peers and those people that they had thought that they were their sort of community or support system or a sense of family with people in sort of self-destructive relationships here. So it's difficult. If you ever thought of like trying to step out of something that you were sort of involved in and sort of creating a whole new life for yourself, you have to think of these factors. You know, and also a new identity and who people are. You know, we've had it where we've seen, you know, women make it all the way maybe to sort of community college and not feel like they fit in, that, oh, I'm different. You know, there's something, and because the stigma of being in that life is so strong, it really is. That's why peer advocacy works the best. Because it's not anything that I have a gift about, it's just because I had that shared experience. And so that sort of like breaks that barrier right down. And it doesn't, and then women feel like, oh, okay, you know, I can sort of tell my story. I'm not going to be judged because most of the time people are judged. Just think of that word prostitute, you know, or prostitution. Trafficking also, but that one word has a very strong, like, sort of stigma associated with it. It's beginning to change because we're sort of that double standard. So we're looking at the buyers now, and we try to, like, you know, not stigmatize the women. So these are some of the things. There's a couple more. So then we have, which is a long list of what I call the structural factors. These are limited employment, educational. I've met young women who have told me they've never had a job before. Maybe they're 22 now. And so you think about what that is to sort of, you know, kind of get into, like, if you want to call it the straight world, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's just being able to sort of, like, because you're so out of the mainstream of life. I don't know how to describe it. It's like, and it happens so quickly. You just don't know even how to be in the regular world. So you have limited options, limited alternatives. So, you know, women have to know that there's something else. And that there's also basic needs. Your relationship with money is also all these little sort of things that no one ever really thinks about, but it plays a huge role here. Even relationship with money, because, you know, sometimes you get into this because when you've not had that, you've been maybe poor in your life and not had things. We live in a very market culture, too. Young people want things. It's sort of like we sometimes, you know, we look at, you know, value what we have, not who we are, but what we have, what we own. You know, we have that, you know, nice bag or, you know, the iPhone and all these things that women want. But it's also the relationship of money, of going, you know, is even though if you didn't keep your money, you still had access to it. And so then to switch over and to go into sort of a job and being able to sort of manage money, it's like a very complicated issue here. So it's like relationship with money, basic needs. Most all the women that I've met when they were referred to me, whether it's through a clinic or a hospital or law enforcement, they had no money. Because, you know, when you get out of that life, you leave with nothing. So we provide a lot of basic supports. Financial supports is huge. Just knowing that they will be financially supported through the process of exiting out. And these are also one of the reasons why when women, you know, and also because we work together here, my role is services. You know, I work with law enforcement. Their role is holding perpetrators accountable. So as, you know, women have to know that they will be supported through this long process. And because some of us sort of know and understand that process, we're sort of able to talk about it and sort of break it down and figure out what women need here. Even I work with an immigration attorney who's a great attorney, and even that, you know, for foreign nationals, if they're eligible for certain benefits, there's a long period of time where they don't have financial supports. So this is what we do. Also, inadequate services. Sometimes women have told me that they've accessed services before, but they just couldn't make that connection. They didn't have an opportunity to talk and share stories and understand, because it is about shared stories sometimes when you've been marginalized. And the other huge piece about this, too, is the societal factors, the discrimination and the stigma. And I can't emphasize that enough because it also plays a big role in people being able to sort of talk about things. People have also huge issues with courts. Another thing that's happening here is that a lot of women have told me that they don't make their quota, then they're sort of like coerced into doing other things, which is really kind of this, we see this trend a lot, you know, so sometimes people think they just have maybe sex for a fee on their court or their quarry, and when they have these other charges, larceny. We had a young woman recently, 20 years old, she robbed a bank down the street from us. She was under federal probation, and I think the federal probation officer was trying to give her a chance, because when you listen to her story, you know, what chance did she have? She did not make her quota. So the pimp had her go into the bank with a note. And you have to look, you got the whole picture here. I think she weighed like 90 pounds, okay? She looked like she was 16. She went in there with this handwritten note. She didn't even know what she was doing, I think. You know what I mean? And came out of there, and she told me the story. It's just like, you know, it's almost like hard to believe, but these things happen. You know, you're in these sort of coercive relationships. She had nowhere else to go. She was living in a hotel with other women, paid for by this pimp. Where else was she going? So you think of all these things. So when people don't make their quota now, there's this trend to do other things. And I know some of it because I work a lot with Boston police. We see this happen a lot. Maybe carry drugs, you know, do other things, check cashing, all kinds of different things. You know, because it's all about this sort of being, you know, it's exploitation and money. So these are some, you know, I have 100 stories, but I just wanted to at least give some sort of example of the complexity of this. And also, a lot of this, too, is about how you work with women that have been marginalized. You know, there's sort of a way to do it. It's almost like you have to come at this, and I think there's a lot of great law enforcement people, too, who do this well, sort of, you know, breaking down that power imbalance. Because women, when you come at somebody with authority, with power, because don't forget, women have had this prolonged history, sometimes starting off as child abuse or neglect or different things that, you know, very sensitive to sort of power here. So when I talk with women and other people talk with people that have had these histories, it's almost trying to level the playing field here and sort of giving them power back a little bit and not coming across. If I came across in an inauthentic way or sort of in this way of feeling like I was the expert or I had this sort of, you know, we all sort of have these judgments sometimes. And on bad days, if I feel like I'm judging somebody, I can feel it and they can feel it too. It sort of breaks that down. Because people are sensitive to this, especially these women in this industry, because they feel that sort of judgment. So you want to come at somebody in a very sort of, you know, kind and authentic way and let them tell their story. Let them just, you know, say what's going on with them. Allow them, especially with law enforcement, to sort of give them a little time to sort of, you know, be able to tell their story, to sort of like understand how difficult it is and, you know, and not, even if you feel a little judgment, you can't have it in a way. And I think we all have been in situations where we work with sort of marginalized populations that have felt who have been deeply hurt in life. And so you want to come at this in a caring way. you know, and an authentic caring. And sometimes even with that, you can sort of like, you know, challenge people's behavior and sort of like bring things up because, you know, really, we're really here to help you out. And so there's a style about this, I think that's really important. And I think that goes with a lot of different situations. Because again, when you've had women, you know, it's a lot about how you relate to people and how you come across and how, again, how authentic, how real you are. We don't all have to have the same story, you know, but I know that, you know, when you've had sort of an understanding of the lived experiences of certain populations, it gives you sort of better insight. So I hope this sort of explains the exiting process, the kind of young people who are most vulnerable to this, because again, really, I see in communities, especially in Boston, and I know Framingham, I've worked with women who lived in some of the hotels out here, you know, we have a huge vulnerable domestic problem here as well, okay? So just consider that, because sometimes they are viewed as difficult and challenging women, but think about what their story is, because when you hear their story, I actually have to honor them for what they've been through and that, you know, and the things that they had to do to survive. So thank you, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Our next talk is entitled Human Trafficking, Statewide Prosecution and Prevention by Assistant Attorney General Jennifer Snook. Jennifer Snook is currently, as I mentioned, an Assistant Attorney General in the Human Trafficking Unit of the Massachusetts Office of the Attorney General. She previously served as an Assistant District Attorney in the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, most recently on the Framingham Superior Court team, where she prosecuted major felony cases. Before becoming an attorney, Ms. Snook was a victim witness advocate in the Middlesex District Attorney's Office. She's a graduate of Tufts University and New England School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Assistant Attorney General Jennifer Snook.
Good evening. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about the statewide efforts on behalf of the Attorney General's Office to combat the human trafficking problem. And I don't want to repeat too much what Sergeant Pomalis has already told you about the human trafficking laws, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about it. When you think about it, what is human trafficking? It can be commercial sexual exploitation of vulnerable populations, commercial sex induced by force or coercion, commercial sexual exploitation of children, or forced labor. The business of human trafficking can take many different forms. There's what you'd think of as typical street prostitution, the massage parlors that Sergeant Pomalis talked to you about, but it also, again, the forced labor. It could be in industries that you see every day and have no idea that this is going on in, such as hotel workers, restaurants, nail salons, businesses such as that. And we're seeing more and more frequently with respect to prostitution that it's moving into the internet. These services are being advertised on websites such as Backpage.com, Craigslist.com. Prior to the human trafficking legislation statewide being in effect, the way the police and prosecutors would often encounter human trafficking victims would be through child exploitation, when they encounter runaways engaged in prostitution, so-called voluntary or consensual prostitution. These workers were often involved with drug abuse and had lack of family support. They would also encounter underpayment and overwork of laborers. Again, prior to the human trafficking statute, there were several statutes that could be used and are still used to prosecute human trafficking cases, such as inducing minors into prostitution, deriving support from prostitution, maintaining a house of prostitution, engaging in sexual conduct for a fee, and solicitation of prostitution. The human trafficking legislation in Massachusetts became effective February 19th of 2012. And the focus really of that legislation was to take the focus off the prostitutes, off the victims of these cases, and focus it on the buyers of commercial sex as well as the operators and providers of it, those people who are profiting off the selling of these women and children. The goals of the human trafficking legislation were to protect these individuals from labor and sexual exploitation and to address the gaps in existing criminal law. And it also addressed the growing use of the internet as a tool in the commercial sex for fee industry. The legislation, what it did was it did create new state-level criminal offenses. It increased penalties for existing crimes. It aimed to reduce demand for commercial sex. It aimed to increase services for victims and increase information sharing between social services and law enforcement. Trafficking for sexual servitude, whoever subjects, recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains another person to engage in commercial sexual activity or benefits financially or by receiving anything of value shall be punished. And the interesting part to this statute is that you don't have to prove for force or coercion with respect to proving a human trafficking charge against somebody, which that does differ from the federal law. If the victim is 18 years or older, the penalty is not less than 5 years in state prison, not more than 20 years in state prison. If the victim is under 18 years, it's a potential life sentence. Trafficking for forced services subjects or attempts to subject another person to forced services or recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains by any means or attempts to recruit another person knowing that person will be subjected to forced services or benefits financially or receiving anything of value. Here, we do have to prove that there was fraud, force, or coercion involved to prove a human trafficking charge when it involves labor, not commercial sex. With this legislation, as it aimed to decrease demand for commercial sex, increase the penalty for solicitation of a prostitute. It's now up to 2.5 years in the House of Correction, and it increased the penalties for soliciting a prostitute under the age of 18. With respect to the Attorney General's office's efforts in combating human trafficking cases, in 2012, after a lengthy wiretap investigation, the Attorney General's office did indict 4 individuals for a sex trafficking case in East Boston and Chelsea. It was the first human trafficking case charged under the new legislation, and after trial earlier this year, 3 defendants were convicted of human trafficking. And since that first case, the Attorney General's office has indicted 12 more cases 12 more individuals for human trafficking. The cases that we take in the Attorney General's office really focus on the multi-jurisdictional, cross-county cases and high-impact cases. Other tools of the human trafficking legislation include safe harbor provision, creating a Victims of Human Trafficking Trust Fund, interagency task force, civil remedies for victims of human trafficking, forfeiture process, a process for taking the assets of traffickers, provisions to the address confidentiality of trafficking victims, and sex offender registry requirements for certain convictions. It also goes to, with respect to the protection of sexually exploited children. The practical effects of the human trafficking legislation, it makes it easier for us to try to prove these cases without victims' cooperation. As Sergeant Pomalis talked to you about, as Sherry talked to you about, there could be many reasons why a victim may not wish to participate or may not feel ready to participate in a prosecution. And we really try to build our case so that we may not ever need the victims to have to testify. We do that by looking at the financial aspect of the business. Who's renting these hotel rooms? Who's paying for these ads? We can do that by getting bank records, by getting internet records for the postings for the hotel records, phone records to see who's posting all these things. The Attorney General's office does have a unit specifically devoted to human trafficking cases. We are a multidisciplinary team. We have 3 state troopers assigned specifically and solely to human trafficking cases, 2 specialized prosecutors who prosecute just human trafficking cases, and victim witness advocates who work with us as well. And we are also involved in the coordination of a Massachusetts interagency human trafficking task force. That task force was created by statute in November of 2011, and it was tasked with recommending policy changes to state legislature to improve response to human trafficking. It focuses on service development, demand reduction, system changes, public awareness, and training. And it is chaired by Attorney General Martha Coakley and includes state and community agencies. The task force issued its report in August of 2013. There were 5 subcommittees presented recommendations in the report issued by the Attorney General. These recommendations included areas of demand reduction, public awareness, data collection, victim services, and training and education. The groups have been formed after the task force and are tasked with implementation of these recommendations. One example I can give is the task force that is working on creating a safe house for victims of sex trafficking, similar to a shelter for domestic violence victims. That is my contact information. Certainly feel free to call with any questions. I have copies of the task force report over on the side table if anyone is interested. Please feel free to take a copy.
Thank you very much, Jen. Our next talk is entitled Community Programs to Address Human Trafficking, Middlesex Trace Initiative, and the Rights Project. It is going to be co-presented by District Attorney Ryan and ADA Patrick Fitzgerald, so I'd like to introduce both now at once. So, Marion Ryan was appointed Middlesex District Attorney by Governor Patrick in April of 2013. She's been a prosecutor for over 30 years, all of those years spent with the Middlesex DA's office. She's held previous positions as Chief of the office's Elder Disabled Unit, Chief of Domestic Violence Unit, Senior Counsel to the Family Protection Bureau, and General Counsel. She's prosecuted hundreds of major felony cases, including murder, rape, child abuse, armed robbery, domestic violence, and elder abuse. As committed as she is to the prosecution of crimes, DA Ryan is equally committed to crime prevention. She has launched a number of programmatic initiatives to combat crime through partnerships with both traditional and non-traditional stakeholders. She's worked to create several public-private partnerships with law firms to assist victims of domestic violence through the civil restraining order process, with salon professionals to detect and respond to signs of abuse exhibited by clients, with the business community to implement workplace safety programs, with healthcare providers to better protect children and elders, and with colleges and universities to improve and promote campus safety. A graduate of Emmanuel College and Boston College Law School, D.A. Ryan lives in Belmont with her husband and is the mother of 2 children. Patrick Fitzgerald has been an assistant district attorney with Middlesex District Attorney's Office since 2001. In that time, he has prosecuted cases in the district, juvenile, and superior courts of Middlesex, including Framingham. Mr. Fitzgerald joined the Child Protection Unit in 2005 and became Deputy Chief of that unit in 2008. Please join me in welcoming Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan and Middlesex Assistant District Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald.
Evening. I'm going to start first and talk a little bit about the Middlesex Trace Initiative. Middlesex County, for those of you who don't know, are the 54 cities and towns pretty much outside of Boston, including the Metro West towns and Framingham. Middlesex is very diverse. It has 1.5 million residents, ranging from urban to suburban to very rural communities, as far south as the Mass Pike, up along Route 495, and as far east as Route 93. So it's quite an extensive population of individuals. Within the Middlesex DA's office is the Child Protection Unit, which also houses the Middlesex Children's Advocacy Center. We are a DA-based children's advocacy center. While certified by the National Children's Alliance, we are fortunately funded by the DA's operating budget. The Middlesex Children's Advocacy Center has 8 full-time assistant district attorneys, 2 part-time, 5 victim witness advocates, 3 full-time child interview specialists, a nurse practitioner who works part-time, and 3 administrative professionals. The Middlesex Trace Initiative began when this new human trafficking legislation took effect back in February of 2012. As been explained to you already, prior to that, we really didn't have legislation that allowed us to hold those who were perpetrating human trafficking-related offenses without the cooperation and the assistance of the victims. These new crimes, this new legislation has allowed us to now continue to investigate and hold those accountable without the assistance of a victim. As Sherry's explained in detail, the number of reasons why we cannot necessarily rely upon the cooperation of a human trafficking victim in fulfilling our obligations in court, and that's certainly understandable. So we've made a lot of headway in terms of being able to hold those accountable. The new legislation and the TRACE initiative, which stands for Team Response Against Child Exploitation, is really, again, to enforce the spirit of the new legislation, not only in holding perpetrators accountable, but to providing the resources and the assistance to victims and to further the prevention efforts that come along with it. As Jen indicated, there are a number of subjects that cover human trafficking, but the commercial sexual exploitation of children is what we handle with the Middlesex Trace Initiative. Within the Child Protection Unit, commercial sexual exploitation of children involves children under the age of 18, so children 17 years of age or under. And there was a common misconception prior to this legislation and in general about what is commercial sexual exploitation. And a lot of what people were thinking was it's prostitutes at a street corner in the more urban areas. But that's far from what we're seeing as to where these victims are coming from and where these services are taking place. It could be a street-level prostitution, but most often, and what we're seeing most commonly, is these areas. It could be child pornography, children under the age of 18 involved in exploitative pornography, either the taking or the distribution of photographs of them in states of nudity or engaged in sexual conduct. There's quite a demand of that. With the advent of the internet and cell phones, that's a daily occurrence. And children who don't necessarily have the emotional maturity to appreciate the long-standing effects of trading or engaging in this type of pornography, we see that quite a bit. And that's every bit of exploitation, and we consider it as such and treat it as such. Stripping, erotic and nude massages, these are all things that happen behind closed doors, not out in the streets. So it's not something that we will see in our everyday walking down the street. It's things that are happening behind closed doors. So we really need to be taking a look at who these children are, who these perpetrators are, and trying to identify where they are and what they're doing. Phone sex line, gang-based prostitution, again, individuals who are involved in gang-related activity. Commercial sexual activity and human trafficking is very much an organized crime. These are very large, organized enterprises of a number of individuals, not only locally but on a state level, but nationally and internationally. We find in these investigations that there are large networks that are widespread of individuals. It's very much a lucrative business for a lot of individuals. Interfamilial pimping, family situations with a relatively dysfunctional family, ways of making money. There is exploitation of children in that context as well. And certainly, as Jen has indicated and as others, the internet. That has been, particularly in Middlesex, the #1 way we are finding and locating human trafficking related activity here in Middlesex. And again, private parties, that's somewhat related to the internet, where activities and organizations are organizing gatherings in hotel rooms or at private residences, wherever they can find the space and can provide the services where the demand is best. What we know through training and research and data, and what we have found here as our experience in Middlesex, the average age into the commercial sex industry is between the ages of 12 and 15 years old. And as Cherry talked about, we see young women at all ages, but the average age of entry is 12 to 15 years old. So we are particularly focusing our efforts on prevention at the middle school level and the high school level, as it's deemed that these girls, and I say girls where the data is overwhelming, that the individuals and the young children who find themselves engaged in commercial sexual activity are predominantly girls. It's not that boys are not selling sex, but it's in a different way, that it is predominantly the girls who are involved in these organized enterprises, and they're the ones who have been identified, and a lot of the prevention and intervention efforts have been geared toward them. But we are particularly mindful and appreciative of that boys are very much victims of human trafficking related offenses as well. We are finding that 70 to 90% of those children who find themselves commercially sexually exploited have some sort of history of child sexual abuse or other type of trauma-related activity. In Middlesex County in particular, the victims that we are identifying, and since this law took effect, there have been a number of mechanisms that I'll talk about. how we're able to identify these victims, the predominance of them are already involved with the Department of Children and Families and come from a particular background that makes them particularly vulnerable. But the research and the data tells us that pretty much any girl, no matter where they come from, no matter what their background is, particularly vulnerable to finding themselves involved in commercial sexual activity. They don't necessarily have to have a traumatic-related background, but the allure of money and access and clothing and time and attention is certainly something that lures any vulnerable middle school or high school age girl who may be lacking that in their lives. It is no longer a street crime, as I've stated. The predominance of the reports that we're getting in Middlesex County over the last 2.5 years has been referrals and information and intelligence from local hotels and motels. That's where this is happening. Private parties as well, behind closed doors. And again, it's the education and the mindfulness of local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and the community at large who's been able to assist us in identifying victims and perpetrators and particular enterprises in these cities and towns. And again, internet-based exploitation, again, is by far the #1 way in which we are finding these exploitative services being advertised and being offered. Backpage.com, again, I'll repeat it, that is the #1 website that is known for advertising these types of services. Social media, again, these girls in particular, middle and high school ages, are making contact with these perpetrators, with these so-called pimps, through social media, meeting up with them on Facebook or meetup.com. Every day there's a new social media website that comes out that children are attracted to, and the perpetrators know that, and they are predatory in attracting those particular vulnerable teenagers who are most vulnerable to engaging in this type of behavior. So that's what we're finding as well. And everybody has a cell phone, everybody has an internet-based service plan, and it's as easy as that. That's all it takes, is a child with a cell phone who has access to an internet, who is vulnerable and who can be attracted and drawn into this business. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. We need to get the word out. The Middlesex Trace Initiative, along with the Middlesex DA's office, we're out in the schools sending the message. Some particular changes to the law that has been most helpful to us in identifying these children who are involved in this type of behavior. The mandated reporting laws pursuant to Chapter 119, Section 51A changed, where mandated reporters who are individuals and professionals whose work brings them in contact with children on a daily basis, school bus drivers, teachers, doctors, particularly identified by the legislatures, who are mandated to report child abuse and neglect, are now mandated to report child exploitation as well. So it is equally important, as deemed by the legislature, that exploited children need protection, and that they are mandated to report suspicions and mere suspicions. So if a mandated reporter or any citizen, quite frankly, can file a report with the Department of Children and Family alleging abuse, neglect, and now exploitation. And the law has also changed where the Department of Children and Families is mandated to immediately refer any allegations of child exploitation to the local district attorney in which the child lives and where the alleged criminal exploitation occurs. So we are getting referrals from the Department of Children and Family, again, involving children who are already involved with the department, who may be running away for extended period of time, and there's suspicions that in order to survive while they are on the run, they are exchanging sex for food, shelter, clothing, or money. The cases that we've been able to prosecute over the past 2.5 years involving minors have exclusively involved children from out of Massachusetts. So children who have been brought from outside of Massachusetts to Middlesex County, who have been brought to hotels and motels to sell sex. And it has been, again, through that type of intervention where we've been able to identify these children, locate, and essentially recover them. And again, the hard part has been, as has been explained already, in getting those children, those victims, to open up. We're intervening, and we're in a most immediate manner, and it takes a long time and a lot of intervention and services to get a child to be able to talk to us. So we're encountering those problems every day, and as it's already been explained, we very much have the mindset of working and considering pursuing an investigation and a prosecution without that child's cooperation where we know realistically it may most likely will not be a part. Again, I know you're going to hear a little bit about multidisciplinary team, but the changes in the statute provide for a multidisciplinary team approach to investigating and protecting children of commercial sexual exploitation. And the Middlesex Trace Initiative certainly takes that approach. As we have always done with child abuse and neglect investigations, we take that multidisciplinary team approach, bringing as many people as we can, the stakeholders, to the table to provide the best services to the victim and to provide the best investigatory efforts in terms of providing a deterrence to these perpetrators. The individuals who are part of a multidisciplinary team are the local police department, the state police, as well as federal law enforcement agencies. Particularly with human trafficking related investigations, I can tell you that we have an incredible relationship both at the local level, at the state level, and the federal level with law enforcement agencies. The Middlesex Child Protection Unit sits on a task force with other local district attorney's office, the Attorney General's office, the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts, the FBI, Homeland Security investigators, and other local and state police. The Department of Children and Families, the Department of Youth Services, where we meet regularly, share information, and it's proven to be extremely successful in that respect. DCF, the Department of Children and Families, is a huge resource, and the new legislation has put a lot of mandates on the Department of Children and Families through the safe harbor provisions of this statute to provide services for these children. And again, mental health and medical health providers are an important part as well. Another change to the statute that we found a way in which we are identifying victims, child victims of human trafficking, is through the child requiring assistance petitions. Those of you who may have known the previous legislation of child in need of services petition, if there is a runaway child or a child who is stubborn and is suspected of being involved in exploitative behaviors, not only can a parent or guardian, but a police officer can go down to the local juvenile court and file a petition for services for a child who is suspected of being exploited. And that would involve getting the Department of Children and Families involved in intervening with appropriate services. Again, the Middlesex Children's Advocacy Center here in Middlesex County covers the 54 cities and towns. The Children's Advocacy Center has 3 satellite offices. Our main office is in Woburn, here in the town of Framingham, and our regional office as well as in the city of Lowell. We have forensic interviewing sites in all 3 locations, and our team covers all of the areas in all those cities and towns. We are available Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the number above, 781-897-8400. There's always an assistant district attorney or a victim witness advocate who's available to answer any questions relating child abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And most importantly, our website, www.middlesexcac.org. There's a subsection of TRACE which provides a lot of information for the community regarding our efforts in human trafficking in general. So at this time, I invite District Attorney Ryan to talk about our rights project.
Good evening. I want to talk about 3 things tonight, one of which is how I came to be so involved in this work myself. The second is a scope of the problem as it exists across the country and across our county. And thirdly, one of our other prevention programs that we've developed to be particularly responsive to the issues that arise in these cases. Back in 2006, we, through our community-based justice program, which is one of our outreach programs where we bring together once a week or once every other week in schools, police departments, probation, school officials, everybody who will be having interaction with kids in the schools in that community. We bring them together to just kind of keep an eye on what's happening. Are there kids that we need to connect with services? What's been happening outside that might be impacting the schools? All of those things. In late 2006, up in Lowell, we became aware that there were a number of young girls, and they were middle school to early high school girls, who were seeking to gain admission to gangs, and the initiation rite was that they were forced to engage in a series of coerced sexual episodes. And that was how they would get themselves into the gang membership. And as working outward from that, from what we were learning from some of these girls, we discovered that many of them had family members, female family members, who were also involved in some kind of coerced sexual activity. So as a result of that and the partnership that we had already ongoing in the community-based justice program, we put together a task force to begin working on some of these issues and trying to address what was going on in the homes, what was going on in the community, how could we provide supports so that girls and young women would be more willing to tell us about what was happening, and then what did we do in terms of extricating them from that situation. We had been working on that for about a year and a half when in 2009, and this was what, before we started to focus so much attention on human trafficking, was what would typically happen. This crime is nothing new at all. What would usually happen is we would find instances of trafficking as part of what were seemingly unrelated other crimes. And that's what happened in a case I had in 2009. We had early in the evening, about 10:30, 11 o'clock, a 15-year-old girl was found literally in the gutter on a street up in Lowell. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. She did not survive that injury. Really, that was all we knew. She was just literally lying in the gutter. We didn't know where she had come from. We didn't know what had happened. We knew that it had not happened right there because there had been people right there on the street just shortly before, and nothing had taken place. Did a very lengthy investigation, and we learned that she had been the front seat passenger in a car, that there had been a gunfight that was focused on the driver of that car, that the driver of the car, who was engaged in this battle with someone who was literally on a bicycle who had ridden up, and they were exchanging gunfire through the window of the car. At some point, as he began to pull away and was careening down the street to get away from the man on the bicycle, the young man in the driver's seat had been clever enough to put his seat back a little bit. So his head was now roughly aligned with the post between the doors. A bullet entered the car, aimed at his head, but his head, now remember, is pulled back, went right across in front of him and struck the young woman in the head. So this young woman, who we learned was in the car, in the seat of the car, had been struck by this bullet, and then the driver of the car had literally pulled the car to the side and pushed her out the door. So, of course, we began exploring what was the relationship between these two people. How did she come to be in the car? Who else was in the car? What was going on? And we subsequently learned that both the young woman who'd been in the front passenger seat, as well as another young woman who was in the rear passenger seat directly behind her, were unknown to this individual who was the driver. They were, in fact, engaged in being sent out there by their pimp. They had been picked up on a street corner just a couple of blocks away by the young man who was the driver of the car. The young girl who was in the front seat, who was the person who was actually being sold for that evening, was nervous about going. She had enlisted the person in the back seat, who was a friend of hers, who also belonged to a different pimp in the neighborhood. They happened to encounter each other at the little market as she was waiting to be picked up. And she was nervous, and she encouraged this other young girl to come with her. So the car pulled up with this driver. She got in the front passenger seat. Her friend got in the back passenger seat. They pulled away. They were headed to some kind of apartment that the pimp had available to be used by these men. And unfortunately, the driver happened to encounter this enemy on the bicycle as they were headed there. Resulted in her being struck. Of course, he had no interest or attachment to her, and didn't want her bleeding in his car. He literally pulled to the curb, threw her out, and then threatened the young girl in the back and told her to get out of the car and run. We eventually found that young girl. One of the benefits of all of the work that we had been doing up there is we were really in a position to help her to exit that life, to provide her with safety, to enable her to testify in that case, and when the case was over and he had been convicted, the shooter had been convicted, to enable her to go forward with her life away from the pimp. It was a very, very long struggle. During the course of the couple of years that the case was open, we had her in protective schooling. She was approached any number of times. It took a very long time and a lot of monitoring. We couldn't let her leave on passes. We couldn't let her do anything because she was very vulnerable to just the influence of her old friends. The pimps, both of the pimps had kind of aligned, even though they had a bad relationship, in trying to get her back they were frequently sending other girls that worked for them to the home, to the school where this girl was, because they knew enough not to come themselves. They were sending these other young girls to try to entice her back with offers of money, promises of better conditions. She was really the hero in that story, really persevered, testified in that case, and eventually left that life and was able to be settled somewhere else away from that community. So the good piece of that was it really showed us that that partnership can work. And when you brought all of the agencies together, when you've gotten to know each other, when you're ready to go when something happened. And of course, as is often the case, this young woman, the backseat passenger, when we found her, it was, as it always is, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And we needed to be able to literally snatch her up and move her. Because we had built these good relationships over the year and a half that we were doing this work, we had each other's cell phone. You know, we were able to reach a DCF worker on their cell phone who was sympathetic. He was able to reach out to a residential school that he knew. We were able to do all of that, which had we not had that relationship, if I was starting from scratch, you know, calling the hotline number, sort of saying, let me tell you a story, the likelihood of us being, because it was really critical that as soon as we found out who she was, we could literally snatch her up and get her out so that she didn't become susceptible to so many other things. So that really taught us the value of those prevention efforts, the value of those partnerships, and the value of having everybody in it. We are the district attorney's office, we could not have successfully prosecuted that case on our own because we could not have surrounded her with the array of services that she needed. We could not have dealt with her family. We could not have just made all those connections that we needed so many other agencies to do. So that has really brought us to some of our prevention efforts like the TRACE program. And just in looking in terms of why this is such a pervasive program, we haven't really talked tonight about just the numbers, the pure numbers of this, and why it continues despite so many law enforcement efforts and this new statute. Number one, it's money. The human trafficking industry is a $32 billion industry, which gives you some idea of the scope. It gives you some idea of why, for instance, whether it's our pimps in that case or others are going to such great lengths. There's a lot of money to be protected. In terms of the numbers, we know that 30 million people are trafficked worldwide each year. So, but before you think that's the whole world, 15 to 18 of that happens right here in this country. So it is not just something that's happening around the world and not an enormous number here. And we know that 100,000 to 300,000 young people are at risk to entering the life every year in the United States. So those numbers, you know, as Patrick just talked about, as people from everywhere, they really speak to the importance both of that prevention piece and to the enforcement piece, which we have a much better chance of doing now with respect to Massachusetts and the new legislation. But in terms of the prevention piece, what's been a particular problem, what was a problem in that Lowell case and is a particular problem for us across Middlesex County, is the demographics of Middlesex County have changed dramatically, particularly with respect to populations coming here from other countries. In Middlesex County, 20% of our population is now foreign-born. So that's 5% higher than the state average. State of Massachusetts in general is 15%, is 20% in Middlesex County. 5% of the households across Middlesex County speak a language other than English as their primary language. And there are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. If you took the top 10 in terms of immigrant population, 1/2 of those, so 5 of those, are within Middlesex County. So within Middlesex County, Cambridge, Somerville, Lowell, Framingham, and Malden are in the top 10 statewide for immigrant population. And the numbers are enormous. For instance, Lowell has more Cambodians in the population than any place in the United States except Long Beach, California. So, you know, we have to be looking to that community. Framingham has, as we certainly could see with respect to the game, the 5th highest Brazilian population in the country. And Malden has more immigrants than any other city in Massachusetts. 43% of the population is immigrant. At Malden High School, they speak 81 languages. So that, and the suburbs are the same, whether it's Acton with the South Asian population, Bedford with an Iraqi population, or the Melrose, which has an enormous Turkish population. So we're sort of looking at all of that, looking at the trends, which we see the refugee crisis in Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, and knowing that part of that population will come here. What we know is that in spite of all the challenges that everybody else faces, that immigrants particularly face challenges when they find themselves in situations, particularly involving sex, domestic violence, and women, in coming forward in going to law enforcement. For several reasons. Because in many of the countries that people come here from, the police are brutal and irrational. And it's not unusual that people would come here with that same view that the police might treat them that way here. And that has an impact both for the victims themselves, who are reluctant to come forward. It has an enormous impact for people who may be witnesses in that community where they're most likely to see something, who also do not want to come forward, because there's a whole public safety piece to that. If people are being victimized or are seeing people being victimized and they're not willing to speak up about that, everybody is more at risk because the danger continues. Coupled with that, there's the lack of information and sometimes fear among much of our immigrant population about really what their rights are, what it entails talking to the police. What we often find is even immigrants who have legal status feel that becoming involved in a case, whether as a victim or as a witness, can impact their ability to stay in this country. That's not true. I mean, you're a witness to something, to a car accident, to some piece of violence, and you talk to the police about that. You are legally here. It's not going to impact your ability to stay in this country. But that is a myth that it is almost impossible to put to rest in the immigrant community. And in addition, many members of immigrant communities come here not really being familiar, and we frequently see this, with what the laws are as to what is a crime. There are many things that are not a crime in their country. They come to the United States and really don't have that basic information that it is a crime to do certain things here. And one place where we see that is often in the disciplining of children. You know, discipline that may be acceptable in another culture may well be against the law here. And there's a lack of understanding of that. The same is true with respect to, and we just see, just in the course of this week, when we have young women being executed in other countries, for instance, because they've married without their father's permission, it's not surprising that if that same young woman is suddenly here, that they that they don't have the information that they have the right to refuse to be placed with another man, or that if it's one of the things we talked about is intrafamilial sort of pimping, that if their father or their brother tells them to be with somebody, that they have any right to refuse that, because that is just not true in their country. So as one of the ways to really provide that information and to start to get information out into the community, we began a program which is called our Rights Program. And it's similar to our Cut It Out program. The Cut It Out program in our domestic violence arsenal of education really uses the idea that one of the places that women are likely to confide that they have been the victim of domestic violence is to their salon professionals. And there's a whole lot of reasons, because they may have a long-term relationship. As I always say, I've known the woman who cuts my hair longer than my husband and my kids. So you have that long-term relationship. There's also the fact that many of the humiliating injuries that are inflicted in the course of domestic violence, for instance, what I find to be so frequent, so humiliating, and so incredibly painful, the tearing out of clumps of hair on your back hairline, happen in a way that you and I sitting in a room don't see that. The person who's going to see that is a salon professional. And what I really believe to be at the heart of this, which is, if any one of you in this room tonight had to confide to someone something very frightening, painful, humiliating about yourself, I suggest to you that one of the things you would find hard would be watching the face of the person you were telling. Whether it's you were telling your parents and they were angry, you were telling your best friend and she was sad, or you were telling someone who was thinking, really, do you let that happen? So that's a painful piece. If you take that thought and think about when you're with a salon professional, there are two things that make it likely that that's a good place to talk about. Number one, you really can't multitask. That's one of the few places in the world. You know, you go to the Dunkin' Donuts and they're talking on the phone and they're making your coffee and they're doing all sorts of things. Can't really do.
This is a coordinated monthly test of the broadcast stations of your area. Equipment that can quickly warn you during emergencies is being tested. If this had been an actual emergency, official messages would have followed the alert tone. This concludes this test of the emergency alert system.
In that same concept of partnering with private agencies and outside stakeholders, and this rights project where we've begun providing the same kind of information to tutors. We began in Malden in the Immigrant Learning Center, where they have an enormous number of tutors. They have hundreds of people go through that center every week, because what we discovered was a number of things. Many times for an immigrant in Middlesex County, the tutor is really the only English-speaking person they may know initially. So not only do they rely on that person to help them learn English, but they begin to rely on them for any number of things. Will you help me study for my citizenship test? Will you help me find a daycare center? Will you help me learn how to drive? So that same kind of intimate, dependent relationship develops over a fairly long period of time, much like you might have with your salon professional. Many times the tutors don't have the information either about what's legal, what people's rights are, what rights they have an opportunity to apply for, whether it be from Homeland Security or whatever it is. So what we've done in this training is we go out with Homeland Security, with the local police departments. We first of all are very clear about the fact that we understand that people may have had bad experiences with or have fears about Homeland Security or other agencies. So first of all, that's the federal government. We are the local government who want to protect against crimes. Second of all, here is what really is the case. And Homeland Security, I have to say, has come a long way in terms of being much more user-friendly, in terms of being much more clear about what rights people have, what the opportunities are for people who become a victim of violence to apply for a U visa or some other way to remain in the country, what the opportunities are to apply for some kind of asylum, particularly around sexual activity where engaging in that sexual activity might make it impossible for a woman to return to her own country based on what she's disclosed to people. So we do that pieces of it. We do really demystify some of that process, raise awareness about the rights that people have, and then in the same way that we do with the Cut It Out program, introduce those tutors to what there is in the community, what kind of services are available. So if someone tells you or you realize that someone may be in a forced sexual situation, what can you offer them? Where can you point them to go? So we bring all of those together because it's the same as what happened in Lowell when we did that task force. It's so much easier if I'm a tutor. Now one of my students starts to talk to me about something, and I'm not calling a stranger, but I've met Sherry before, or I've met one of us before. Now I have a place that I can call and say, can I ask you a question about this? Let me talk to you a little bit about that. So that program, we started, as I said, at the Immigrant Learning Center in Malden. We did 25 of the tutors, spoke with those tutors on that day. And coming out with us was the Department of Homeland Security, Victim Rights Law Center, the local service providers, and local legal assistance bureaus. We've just received a commitment from the English at Large program. That's an organization based in Medford, and it operates in 21 of our 54 cities and towns, providing the same sort of services, the English tutor services. So we'll be starting that fairly soon. So that's a piece of where we are in terms of our recognition of the size of the problem and the prevention efforts that we're putting together to deal with that. So thank you for having us all here tonight.
Thank you very much, D.A. Ryan and ADA Fitzgerald. Our next talk is entitled A Multidisciplinary Response to CSEC, Commercial Exploitation of Children. and that will be given by Beth Bouchard. Beth Bouchard is the Support to End Exploitation Now Coalition Case Coordinator at the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County in Boston, Mass. Beth earned her BA from Boston College, studying history and international studies with a focus on social movements and feminism. With a background in advocacy and victim services, her professional roles have included sexual assault crisis prevention intervention specialist at the YWCA of Silicon Valley, emergency guest advocate at Dove Inc., and caseworker at the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program of Lutheran Social Services. Beth has experience working with survivors of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and human trafficking, as well as undocumented and refugee populations. As SCENE's case coordinator, Beth has coordinated a multidisciplinary response for over 300 at-risk and commercially sexually exploited children. Working daily with the Boston Police Department Human Trafficking Unit, the Office of the Suffolk County District Attorney, victim service providers, the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, court and juvenile justice providers, and community partners, Beth facilitates vital communication, navigates state and local systems, provides local outreach, and ensures that each child referred receives a coordinated response. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Bouchard.
Good evening. And at first, I'm going to start by talking about our SCENE Coalition, what it is, where we're located, and I want to talk a little bit about the background of how the coalition came to be, and then dive in more specifically into our multidisciplinary response and the services that we offer to young victims. So the Support to End Exploitation Now Coalition is a program of our local Children's Advocacy Center. It's the CAC in Suffolk County. And we're a program that consists of over 35 different community partners. We work with state, federal, and local partners, including the Department of Children and Families, the Department of Mental Health, Department of Youth Services. We work with probation, Boston Juvenile Court, and many other community service providers and therapeutic supportive services. We are located within our CAC, and we are situated within our Family Justice Center. So as Sherry mentioned, we sit upstairs above Sherry, and we're co-located with 4 different local police units, including the Boston Human Trafficking Unit. In addition to Sherry downstairs, we work with various other service providers, those representing domestic violence, and also the My Life, My Choice program, which provides survivor mentorship to youth. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what is CSEC. Patrick did a great job about describing the various types of exploitation that we see locally and providing a really great definition. But I can tell you that out of the cases referred to SCENE, the majority that we see involve youth who are involved in escorting, escort services, working with gang-based prostitution, with pimps and third-party exploiters, and we see increasingly a lot of internet-based exploitation, which can take various forms. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. Patrick had mentioned that the average age of entry into the commercial sex industry in the U.S. is 12 years old, and we do find that our numbers are very consistent. Last year, about 1/3 of our cases were ages 14 and under. So in Suffolk County, back in 2001, there was a death of a young woman, and it was very tragic to find out that even though this young woman was connected to many different agencies, many different systems, many different community partners, her death was not able to be prevented. And it was discovered after her death that she had been involved in commercial sexual exploitation. This young girl had been working with child welfare, she'd been working with juvenile justice system, and she'd been living in a residential facility. And some of the providers working with her had heard rumors about possibly being involved in prostitution and some concerns about some of the older boyfriends that she might have been dating. And despite having this disjointed information, the providers involved in her case really weren't speaking together about the concerns. And so her death really served as a catalyst for folks coming together and saying we need to do something about this problem. And there was a perception of a significant problem at that time. Many different community providers were saying, you know, I'm working with girls and I'm seeing X, Y, and Z. I'm seeing these red flags and these risk factors. Or I had a case that was similar to this. Kids talk to me about this all the time, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't know who to report to. And at that time, back in 2001, in the early 2000s, there were no numbers, no documentation. In 1 year, there were 5 prostitution-related arrests statewide for minors. There were no police reports or DCF reports documenting exploitation in a consistent manner. So some service providers were working with youth but weren't reporting to law enforcement. And some law enforcement were finding victims and encountering young girls who might be exploited, but rather than charge them, they were saying, okay, honey, why don't you go home? We don't want to get you in bigger trouble. And so at that time, there was little, if any, communication among the providers working with girls about exploitation, and there were very few, if any, specialized services. And so out of the discussions at that time, various community partners in Suffolk County came together. And these partners could all agree on these core beliefs. They said commercial sexual exploitation is a form of child abuse. It's a form of sexual abuse. And so even though youth are being treated as criminals in some instances, even though they're being charged with solicitation or sex for a fee, their victimization really needs to be recognized. They were saying that exploited youth should be treated as victims, not as offenders and not as delinquents. And they were noting that it was just as important to identify pimps and exploiters as victims and holding child abuse offenders accountable for their actions. Providers at that time were noting that exploited youth deserved a coordinated and multidisciplinary response like other victims of child abuse, although they weren't getting it in the same fashion. So at that time, our district attorney had made a commitment that he wasn't going to charge minors in our community with exploitation-related offenses. Instead, we tried to develop a response that would divert children to services. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that response looks like, but I do want to highlight that at that time, the folks at the table were really able to come together and recognize that they had a shared responsibility, that these kids were everyone's kids, that CSEC was a reportable condition, and so that needed to be reported when folks were encountering instances of exploitation, that partners needed to identify and intervene when they identified high-risk youth, and that police and prosecutors had to be included in part of the process because only those folks could target demand and really hold offenders accountable for what they were committing. And so for those who are familiar with children's advocacy centers, CACs operate in multidisciplinary teams. There are folks from different realms who come together to try to address a variety of needs that kids have. So there's prosecutors, there's victim witness advocates, there's DCF investigators. Oftentimes there's mental health clinicians included in the teams or pediatric SANE nurses. So not only are investigation needs being met, but the child's being supported, receiving therapeutic referrals. And DCF and child welfare can work with families around placement and residential concerns. So in addition to the MDT partners that our CAC was used to traditionally including, there were some new folks at the table. And I'd like to highlight a couple of those. Some of our really, really strong partners now include juvenile defense attorneys, because really those folks are the ones who are interacting with kids in the juvenile court system through CRAs when they're running away or when they're being identified as stubborn. A lot of the youth that are referred to SEEN have prior court involvement through delinquency charges. And oftentimes those charges are related to exploitation. So if a child was caught for larceny or for shoplifting or boosting something at Macy's for a pimp, that charge is linked to exploitation. And so if we can include their juvenile defense attorney in our teams, then they might be able to work with the youth and really get to the root of a problem. Also on our teams, in addition to having the Boston Police Department, we work very closely with Homeland Security, with the FBI, and also state police, because our kids aren't staying neatly within Suffolk County, but as was mentioned before, they're really crossing different counties. They're crossing different state lines. And so there can be a variety of law enforcement who are involved in responding to these cases. We also work very closely with juvenile detention, the Department of Youth Services, because many of our kids who have delinquency backgrounds have been connected to DYS previously, and then to the court clinics, because oftentimes kids are meeting with clinicians in the court multiple times, and so those clinicians might have a sense of the needs and the experiences that youth are going through. And so through these conversations and these partnerships, the folks at the table were able to look beyond harm reduction and beyond rescue and come together and develop a youth development model. So we're trying to include youth in their healing process, but recognizing that it takes a long time and includes a lot of different partners working to address a lot of different needs and issues in the various realms of a child's life that Sherry was pointing out earlier. And so we really focus on these 4 tenets. We try to raise awareness and training. We try to make sure that all cases of CSEC are being screened and identified, that they're then reported and referred to the appropriate places, and that then we can enact our CSEC multidisciplinary response. And so first, when we go out in the community and we're doing outreach and talking about awareness and training, we want to make sure that folks who are interacting with youth can really recognize those red flags and indicators that might suggest that a child's at risk for CSEC. It's really important that the folks who are seeing kids every day, their medical providers, their teachers, law enforcement, mandated reporters, that they know what exploitation looks like and that they can pick it out so that they can identify those kids in trouble. And so these are many of the risk factors that we see in that cases who are referred to SCENE often exhibit. And SCENE receives referrals not only for cases that have a disclosure where a child's come forward and talked about the exploitation that they've been through, but also kids who are considered at risk for exploitation. And usually that involves having multiple indicators. So even if a child hasn't disclosed and said, I'm a victim, which often times they're not going to say, as was discussed earlier, providers are picking up that there's some big red flags. And some of the major ones in this list include reports of running away, especially repeated instances of running away, with no explanation as to where a child's running. We have kids who run for hours in a day, we have kids who run overnight, and then kids who run for weeks or months. And the youth who are running away from home are super vulnerable to the tactics and the motives of pimps and perpetrators. We had one case last year where a child had been living at a residential facility, and there were so many kids running from that facility that providers there said, okay, we want to ask kids to take off their shoes because that might reduce the risk of them running away if they don't have shoes on. And so we had a young girl who left that center, and she ran away without shoes. And within a couple hours, there was a pimp who saw her and said, oh, you don't have shoes on. Why don't I come buy you a pair of shoes? And you look dirty, and you have a backpack, and you need to wash your clothes, and you need a place to sleep. I can help you with that. And so not only was she, had a red flag or a target on her because she wasn't wearing shoes, but pimps and perpetrators are really good at picking up on the most vulnerable kids. And kids who are unsupervised, who are alone, who are at public transit spots by themselves, are really, really vulnerable. And that's often where we find that pimps and exploiters are finding kids. Also, unexplained absences from school, or if a child's frequently tardy. We do see sometimes that if a child's run away from home, even if they're not calling their parents or their family, even if they're not returning home, sometimes they're still returning to school, even if they're not in class. And so one of our partners who we engage with regularly now is school resource officers. And we work really closely when there's a missing persons report with connecting with school resource officers to say, have you seen this kid? Have you heard any rumors or any of the friends concerned about where this child might be? We see if a child has been running away for a period of time, if they run away, but then they come back with unexplained money, with their hair done or their nails done, expensive items, new clothing, that's a big red flag because these children aren't working, so where are they getting those goods? We also see youth who are receiving phone calls, particularly from older males, or having a lot of Facebook contact from older males. That's a big red flag in addition to other indicators. And so you can kind of read through the rest of the list. One of the big ones that we notice is a loss of interest in age-appropriate activities. And we recently had a case with a 15-year-old girl, and she was a young 15, had just turned 15. And she really wasn't interacting with other girls in her group home. She wasn't wanting to do anything or talk with them. And she opened up about it and said, with the things that I've been through, I don't feel like a little girl. I don't feel like a kid. When my 10-year-old sister comes to visit, she can play with everybody and talk with folks, but I don't feel like I'm the same anymore. So kids who are acting a lot older than they are, that's been a big red flag for us. And I also would mention that around the Facebook piece for kids who are missing, that's a tool that we use to find where kids might be, because it's amazing how many kids, when they run away, if they think that they're being really stealthy, and if they can't be found, they might be posting a photo that has a street name on it or has another town name on it. And so we're looking, when our kids are missing, at Facebook and social media and trying to see if they left any clues of where they might be. And so then our model, once we have identified kids who are at risk or who are exploited, talks about the what now, what next, what do we do from here? And so that the piece that we established and which is now codified through the safe harbor legislation is filing that 51A. If CSEC is a form of child abuse, which it is, there should be a 51A filed by mandated reporters so that the appropriate responders can find that information and then make plans together. And so in our community, reporters file a 51A. And they describe the allegation, they describe the risk factors, and they also mention that they'd like a scene referral to be made. Whether or not they mention the scene part, our DCF partners and our district attorney's office both are flagging those cases. So if a DCF screener says, okay, there's concerns of escorting or prostitution, we're going to refer to scene. And when the mandatory referral is made to the DA's office, if they see those same indicators, they're going to be referring to scene. Usually DCF will not be getting involved in those cases. They'll be screening them out because most often in our community, the exploiter is a third-party exploiter. Not always, but most often. And so from there, we still have that report, and then we can look at that history of that child and move forward with our MDT response. And so this is just a case flow of how our model works. You can see at the top, cases come in, the 51A report is filed. It trickles down to the scene case coordinator. And from there, my role is really identifying all the different providers already working with youth, all the different resources that they may have, if they have involvement with child welfare, if they have court involvement, if they have a really strong relationship with a guidance counselor. We're trying to find out who those key people are right away. But we're also looking for gaps in services. So if a child needs a mentor, particularly a survivor mentor, someone that they can relate to and talk to about exploitation concerns, if safety is a concern and law enforcement need to be pulled in, mental health, medical, we address all these different realms and try to fill the gaps, so identify services that are missing at the time being. And this is just another model that we work at with the scene coordinator really being the hub, connecting all the different providers and collaterals together. And so once we identify the providers who are working with the child and who can be working with the child, we pull them all together. And so this means we either meet in person or we convene even by phone if we have to act fast. And we work on a case review or case conference model. And so we're sharing information, we're talking about the concerns, and then making a plan collaboratively. And it's really shocking how many times there might be someone like a teacher or a guidance counselor who says, you know, I know the name of this child's older boyfriend, or I've seen the car that he drives, I know his license plate number, where law enforcement doesn't have that information and can really use it in the investigation. Or vice versa, if there's a sting and in the middle of the night a detective finds a child, they don't know the mental health background of that child, what supports are in place, what other needs that child has in their life. So it's really important to get all the different players in this individual child's life talking together and then planning out next steps. This is just some of our scene data. Since 2005, when we were first referred cases, we've received over 875 referrals. It's about half and half. About 47% of cases were known to be victims of exploitation, where there was evidence corroborating that they were, or there was a direct disclosure from the youth. Of the remaining cases, 30 of those were identified as a very high risk, so very strong red flags, multiple indicators suggesting that they were exploited, but no disclosure from the youth. Over 65 had a history of involvement with child welfare with DCF. 35 to 40% have been involved with probation, either through CHINS or a CRA or through a delinquency proceeding. Over 62% had a history of running away for a period of time. And over 99% of our referrals are female. We've only received 14 referrals for males and 1 transgender youth. And as Patrick was talking about before, that's not because boys and trans youth are not being exploited, but really in our community, I think providers are much more accustomed to looking at the victimization and identifying the victimization of girls and having resources to contact and call. So SEEN is really actively looking at boys and trans youth and how community providers can better serve and identify those kids. Over 2/3 of the youth referred to SEEN are non-white, and over 54% are under the age of 15. And I won't go into talking about the legislation, as that was already covered so well by Jen, but some of the provisions that really affect SEEN and other youth now statewide within the safe harbor provisions include mandatory reporting. So the legislation that was passed and enacted in 2012 stipulates that CSEC is a form of child abuse. It defines a sexually exploited child that way as a form of child abuse, and so mandated reporters should be filing on youth. It specifies that 51A reports will then be screened out to the district attorney's office. And it also establishes multidisciplinary response teams to youth. So while our MDTs have been codified now in law, the rest of the state is working on ways to implement MDTs and looking at the different ways that that might play out statewide and across various counties. Additionally, there's now a presumption, so rather than charge youth with an exploitation-related offense, courts have the option to divert youth to services, so they can file a care and protection, or they can file a CRA so that youth get the services they need without that criminal charge. And these are just a couple resources around MDTs and a multidisciplinary response to exploitation. Our website is at the bottom there. But Georgetown released a report this spring that talks about 3 different communities nationwide that enact multidisciplinary response teams, and SEEN is one of those models that was profiled. SEEN released a report in 2012 which talks about the formation of our coalition and the services we provide. So that's in the center, and then the Institute of Medicine issued a report looking at CSEC and different ways to combat human trafficking of minors. So those are all resources that you can use. And then finally, that's my contact information at the end. So thank you so much for staying with me.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you, panelists, for being here with us tonight. I appreciate the fact that, as we said, we started a little bit late due to the engagement of excitement outside because of the game. But we still would like to have some time remaining for those of you who might have a question of any of the panelists or on any aspect of the topic. As we said, so first let me just open it up if someone has any questions at all. You guys are getting home early. Yes. Thank you, Kathy, for the question. Yes. Anyone here can answer that? She's a town meeting member. Say something good. Say you need lots of money.
We do need lots of money, yes. That is, as all of us up here could tell you, that is the #1 concern that we all have with that. That is very much a goal of the Interagency Human Trafficking Task Force headed by the Attorney General's Office. That's what they're working on. As Sherry's indicated, as we all have, it's very clear that what's needed for these types of victims is somewhat different than what we traditionally have thought. So the safe house that Jen is referring to, that is a huge issue that we have. We're able to identify these victims, and the Department of Children and Families has been able to be involved, but they too struggle with being able to provide the exact type of services for these children. And as Sherry can tell you from the adult side, likewise, there's very limited resources that we have to provide the services that we need, and that's very much a struggle that we have.
More about this, providing the services that are...
Very good. Thank you. Yes, Mahmoud.
This question is for Sherry. What percentage of folks actually exit?
Well, that's a good question. You know, it's a long process. It's just sort of hard to answer that because it's a process over years. And it's rarely a linear road out. So it's hard to measure specifically, okay? But we stay connected with people. I stay connected with people since I met since 2006, 2007. But what we do is we measure sort of, our goal is to lessen the vulnerability. So if somebody gets a GED, is into college, has housing, these are things that we measure. Because then that lessens the vulnerability of people going back into that. So as soon as somebody has all those factors, like college, viable skills, education, permanent place to live, a new support system. So, you know, I want to say probably 50% meet those, but it's a struggle. Do you know what I mean? So I don't want to like skew statistics here. It's a long struggle for a lot of people because there's so many barriers that get in the way. Does that make sense?
I was just advised by Ron, anybody have a question, please use the microphone up here so that they can broadcast the question also. Although, Kathy, you're heard in the town hall upstairs. It's okay. Anyone else? I had one question, and that is just listening. As I said, we've discussed the idea of trafficking. We have heard from other programs that have been on about trafficking and all the rest. And originally, thank you, Sergeant, for this one, we had thought that perhaps it was not an issue in rural Framingham. This is, you know, we're a divided community, but it doesn't exist. But it certainly appears to exist, and you know, we're a microcosm of all the other cities too and towns. So my question really comes down to: are there signs that the average layperson might see? You know, we talked about the workforce. It's one thing where prostitution is; it seems to be evident. You're asking for some favor or whatever, and you're going to pay for this whatever. But when you think about the work element of it, and you bring out the idea that some of these people that are being trafficked could very well be the person that is working at my local donut shop, could be a person working at another, you know, grocery store, and I wouldn't know it. And how would I ever come to know that? How can I ever perceive that this person is out there? I remember being as an educator, if a child comes into your room with some sort of cut or broken arm or something, you had an obligation to report that, you know, just so it's documented within the school in the event that it had to do something with family abuse. But how would the average person here think of anybody out there in the workforce being as trafficked or anything like that? Can you tell? Or is it impossible to tell?
I don't think it's impossible to say. It's about education and training and outreach and letting people know that this does exist, that it is in the community. It's in every community. I think we see particularly the forced labor type situations, particularly vulnerable communities are immigrant communities where there's a language barrier, as Marion was talking about, the lack of understanding of their rights in this country and the communities. And just being mindful of that in your everyday activities where you see individuals in particular work situations that may not be the more traditional or for the corporate where they're getting paid or required to get paid a certain wage at a certain hour at certain breaks. We see in the immigrant communities where they're not able to get those types of jobs because of language barriers and their legal status. So they're working in environments, more labor type positions where, so if you see that and you see individuals, again, just in your everyday, we see this with children at times when they're absent from school, if they're from immigrant families and they're late from school or they're sleeping in school, it's oftentimes because they're working to provide support for their family overnight in unsafe conditions. Those are red flags that we can see in schools. But getting the word out, educating those individuals to look out for those types of signs is what's needed.
And for us on the street as police officers, we try to tell our police officers to pay attention to your transit points. Over here in Framingham, we have the T station right down the block. We have Logan Express up on the north side of town. We tell them to pay attention to the 24-hour establishments, the Dunkin' Donuts that are open after hours, McDonald's, the Tedeschi's. If you see any younger girls or boys hanging out there, particularly the ones that aren't from the area, to approach them, and speak with them and find out, why they're out and what they're doing, and hopefully, we can get them what kind of services they need.
Housing situations as well. An extraordinary number of individuals living in a particular dwelling or a small dwelling is indicative of individuals who have limited resources and may be most vulnerable to those types of situations as well.
Thank you.
Also, for the sex trafficking piece, a lot of young women have just reported to me that they've, lived in various hotels. Here in Framingham, Malden, there's a specific number of them around the community that, and usually paid for by their pimp, and there might be 3 or 4 women living there. Sometimes they've accessed emergency rooms, maybe different clinics, different things like that, where they might, where people could be more educated and sort of reach out to somebody that might look like there's something going on, but you're not quite sure.
And I think it's, as Sherry said, hotels and motels are the #1 place that we're
Yes.
seeing. And it's, the high-end hotels in downtown Boston, in the suburbs. Framingham and Metro West is particularly vulnerable with the intra and interstate highways that run through here and the local hotels that are along the Mass Pike and 495. People are trafficked much like drugs and guns are. The routes across the country of trafficking humans and children are much the same as guns and drugs, down the 95 corridor through New York. It's amazing. And again, a gun or a drug, that's contraband. It's physical. It's against the law. When you're trading sex and selling sex, it's a lot safer to traffic in that respect because there isn't that necessarily tangible contraband that can be identified and located. And that's why it's easier for individuals who are involved in these criminal enterprises. It's safer for those individuals to do this as opposed to, the drugs and the guns, and to move the enterprise. Like it said, they'll be in one city or town one day, 3 days later they're in the next. They know. So it's, again, getting the word out so that we're all educated for the warning signs. And relationships with the local hotels and motels. The police departments are very good about getting relationships with the management and the employees and swinging by, at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, noticing if there are individuals who are extended stay, or if there are children there during the daytime hours when you would think a child should be in school. That may be a child who's been brought from across the country who's been missing from their family for months at a time. And that's what we, those warning signs. But it's educating the community, the law enforcement officers, developing those relationships to identify those situations, because you're not going to necessarily see them walking by you on the street or driving by you. Unless you know it's out there, you understand and recognize the problem, that's when you're going to have your eyes open and hopefully recognize the warning signs.
Mm-hmm. Also, as for the motel and hotels, as Patrick's saying, is the same thing. Also, educating them. We've done training with the management and the staff, so I tell them the signs to look for in the motels and the hotel rooms, and to give us a call immediately if possible. At least get a hold of one of the guys from my unit, and we will get someone down to take a look at it, which we have with pretty good success.
Great. Yes.
Kathy McCarthy. It seems to me that you all are doing a great job with all the programs and incorporating them, intertwining them for kids and adults that are in trouble. But I would like to think that we're doing something, not necessarily your job, but maybe our schools, the PTOs and things like that, that maybe could fund a program for a drum program or something that would speak to the youth on peer pressure and making good decisions, because you don't have to be poor to make bad decisions. And I think that's a problem that sometimes, you're vulnerable, no one realizes it, and then someone with a bad intent kind of draws you in. So what can we do as a town or the other towns? I know we have school resource offices and everything, but just as a way of reaching people that might not listen to a lecture, so to speak, but whether it be through music or drama or any of these other programs that we can get into the schools to have them think more about decisions and who they're hanging with. And if something seems, how many parents feel like their kids don't feel like they're listening to them, or, they're putting too much discipline on them and they go the other way. So maybe you could give us an idea on that.
One of the things that we already have in place, we have in our office a nonprofit that we operate out of our office called Middlesex Partnerships for Youth. The 54 cities and towns across the county belong. So each school system joins, and then they are entitled, as a result of that membership, to a number of benefits, but it also includes 5 training programs. So we offer a number of training programs for parents, for staff, and for students dealing with good choices. We do a program which we have been doing once a year. We're going to start doing twice a year, an Empowering Girls program, where we bring together 400 middle and high school girls and really talk about good choices across their lives. Eating choices, relationship choices, education choices, all of that. Really talk to kids about how to resist peer pressure, sort of model how they can respond to that. Also bring to that a panel of people with very different careers, so women with very different careers, so that they are at least thinking about there are other things. Maybe I'm not on track to do this, but I could be really interested in this. So we've had great responses to that. We've had good responses as well to the programs where we go out and talk to parents about things like this, human trafficking, about things they should be watching for with their kids. So that's a resource that's already in place. We encourage every community that joins to take advantage of the full range of programs. We also, as part of that membership, offer a very popular series for teachers and staff on mental health issues. And not just mental health in the sense of an already diagnosed condition, but things like this, like what's the effect of peer pressure on kids, that sort of thing. They're offered in a way that the teachers get the continuing education credits that they need. They're typically done in a hospital setting. So those programs have been very popular. Once the town joins, they're free to the parents and staff and students already.
Thank you.
And in Suffolk County, we're really fortunate to work with two programs. The My Life, My Choice program, which does serve folks in Massachusetts up through Springfield and eastward, and then the GIFT program, which is Gaining Independence for Tomorrow. And both programs provide very intensive therapeutic supportive mentorship services. My Life, My Choice is staffed by survivor mentors, and the GIFT mentors are also fabulous and very well trained. And we see that for youth, as far as prevention of CSAC and exploitation, having that interpersonal relationship and that really one-on-one strong support can be a really big help for both girls who've been in the life, but also girls who are kind of, at really high risk and really vulnerable. And the mentors and I think other mentorship programs are really great at helping connect youth to viable skills, education and job opportunities, but also teaching them about tactics that perpetrators use in sexual health, substance abuse. So we really try to look for mentorship and trying to get that one-on-one connection. And at SEEN, we have a youth advisory board, which is comprised of girls, female survivors, who are part of the My Life, My Choice Leadership Corps. And those girls really across the board talk about how they're not just a case. They say, don't treat me like a case, don't treat me like a puppy, and don't treat me like an alien. But they're really individual girls who want their individuality to be expressed. So some are into sports, and some are into dance, and some are into art. And it seems that when they can express that and connect with an adult who really can identify that and kind of foster that, as well as help connect them to employment and gaining access to money, then those girls tend to do better in the long run.
Yeah, that My Life, My Choice program that Beth is talking about, they are in Middlesex schools. It's a 10-week program. They provide a survivor who comes in once a week for 10 weeks. The school provides a qualified who's got an educational background in mental health issues. They've been trained in the My Life, My Choice curriculum. The school can identify up to 10 girls that are at risk, and they will run the program out of the school. So they are in a few here in Middlesex. As Beth said, they cover all Middlesex cities and towns. They go out as far as they can. They are most generous with their time and resources, and they're absolutely open to doing that.
Okay, well, I realize that we have extended our time considerably longer, though I said we started late, but I appreciate the fact that you continue to stay here to answer these questions. I'd like to remind the commissioners that are here, thank you for one, for being here, but two, we don't meet in the month of July, so that we will be meeting again the second Thursday in August. And panelists, be prepared that you might get an invitation again, because I don't know how Vin had spoken to you before, but we were planning to do this about a month and a half ago up at Framingham State University, and things weren't gelling very well. So, but we do want to plan another one in the fall at some juncture up at Framingham State University. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from him soon enough just to see your availability of time and location. It will be probably held right at Framingham State University as we know, Framingham State University has a number of great courses, some on this topic itself. So we're guaranteeing an audience of those students, I'm sure, if they expect to pass. So that being said, I also like to thank Chief Ferguson for being here tonight and sharing your time with us, and again, sharing your expertise in helping to coordinate this activity tonight. And thank you, Mahmoud, for showing here, because Mahmoud was the one who was responsible for getting Vin involved with our commission at one time, and he's moved on to bigger and better things with the Finance Board now, so he's left the commission. But maybe he can give you some funding. I don't know. Maybe that's possible. But my thanks to all of you for being here, and thank you very much, panelists, for being with us tonight, distinguished guests. And it was wonderful. Vin, do you have anything you'd like to offer? Okay, as long as I got your university program in. All right. Thank you very much. And I think the streets are clear.